If you actually start from where Darwin's theory begins, the creation of the human being was so complicated.
And many people don't know that Darwin didn't attempt to explain the origin of the first life.
Dawkins is obviously one of the world's most famous atheists. Are you a believer in God yourself?
I do believe in God.
You think the creator of the universe is God?
I do.
So here's the tough question. When you look at what's happened in Israel and then Gaza in the last 6 months, a lot of people might question, well, why would a God that has the universal creative superpower of the kind that you believe God had to create all this, why would they allow such misery and hell? And Stephen C. Meyer, I'm delighted to say, is here in London.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, you've got an amazing pedigree to discuss all this. You've got a PhD in the philosophy of science from Cambridge. You're a former geophysicist. You now direct the Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture in Seattle. You've had New York Times bestsellers, Signature in Marcel, Darwin's Doubt, Return of the God Hypothesis. And you've been on all the biggest podcasts in the world. This all blew up last week because Tucker Carlson went on Joe Rogan. And I don't know if you saw this, but he said this.
I think we've kind of given up on the idea of evolution. The theory of evolution as articulated by Darwin is like kind of not true. Well, in the most basic sense, the idea that, you know, all life emerged from a single cell organism and over time, and there would be a fossil record of that, and there's not.
Your response?
Well, I don't know what Tucker knows about all this, but something that happened here in London a few years ago. 2016, a major conference convened by the Royal Society, arguably the world's most august and prestigious scientific body, was convened by a group of evolutionary biologists who are dissatisfied with the standard neo-Darwinian theory of evolution. And many of the conveners are calling for a new theory because the primary mechanism of biological change articulated by Darwin and his subsequent followers, now called the neo-Darwinists, the idea of natural selection acting on random mutations and variations, is now understood to lack the creative power to generate major changes in the history of life.
If you actually start from where Darwin's theory begins, the creation of the human being was so complicated. The body, the way we exist is so complicated, it doesn't make any rational sense.
There's two issues, really. There's how do you get to the first life from the simpler non-living chemicals. That's sometimes called chemical evolutionary theory, and that's a complete mess. It's in a state of impasse, and almost everyone, even your recent guest Richard Dawkins, acknowledges we have no chemical evolutionary theory that accounts for the origin of the first life. And many people don't know that Darwin didn't attempt to explain the origin of the first life. Rather, he presumed one or very few simple organisms, which we now know were not simple, and then proposed a mechanism by which you could generate all the new forms of life we see on the planet today.
So is your belief that the Darwin theory actually fails?
I think it does fail.
Well, your best-selling book, new book, Return of the God Hypothesis, you argue there are three big scientific discoveries that point to the existence of God. And I want to go through these. One, the Big Bang theory. So why would that lend support to a theory of a God?
Maybe just a little framing before I dive into the evidence. Professor Dawkins at Oxford has said that the universe has precisely the properties that we should expect if at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And though I'm on the opposite side of this science v. God issue with the good professor, I think he does a marvelous job of framing key issues. And this is one of those great framing quotations. Because what he's saying is that whether we think of it as a scientific question or a philosophical question or both, if we have a hypothesis about reality, the way we test that is by looking at the world around us and seeing if what we see comports with what we would expect to see if our hypothesis were true. And his hypothesis is that of blind, pitiless indifference, which is a shorthand way of saying that everything came about by strictly undirected material processes. And what the materialists expected coming into the early 20th century was evidence of an eternal, self-existent universe, and therefore did not need an external creator. What in fact the astrophysicists, the cosmologists, the astronomers found was evidence of a universe that had a definite beginning, and therefore one that could not have created itself, because before the matter of the universe came into existence, there was no matter there to do the causing. And so the picture of the universe that has emerged starting from the 1920s all the way to the present, both from observational astronomy and from theoretical physics, is a universe that had a definite beginning and therefore requires some sort of external creator or cause.
Dawkins is obviously one of the world's most famous atheists. Are you a believer in God yourself?
I do believe in God.
You know, my big question for all atheists, well, is okay, you don't believe in God, but what was there before the Big Bang, before this all started? To me, and I believe in God, but to me, it suggests there must be a power bigger than the human mind at the start of all this that was able to comprehend what may have happened.
Dawkins wants to portray theistic belief as if it's equivalent to belief in fairies, and he'll concede that, well, it's possible. But I think there's a stronger argument for the theistic case. And that is that when scientists and philosophers reason from evidence, they typically use a method of reasoning that has a technical name. It's called inferring to the best explanation, where the best explanation is one where you're invoking a cause which has the kind of powers that would be required to explain the phenomenon of interest. And you correctly pointed out in your conversation with him that when you get back to that, what physicists often call the singularity, the point where matter, space, time, and energy begin to exist, the materialist is really up against a huge conundrum, because prior to the origin of matter, there is no matter to do the causing. That's what we mean by the origin of matter, that's where it starts.
Right.
And so if you want to invoke a cause which is sufficient to explain the origin of matter, you can't invoke matter. So you need to invoke something which is external to the material universe and is not bounded by time and space as well. And that starts to paint a picture of the kind of cause you would need that has the sort of attributes that traditional theists have traditionally associated with God. God is a timeless, God is outside of time and space, has causal powers.
And do you believe that God created this original single cell from which everything flows to us?
Yeah, I do think there's incredible evidence of intelligent design at the point of the origin of life, because that first simple cell, in the 19th century, Thomas Huxley said that the cell is a simple homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm. He was one of the great scientists of the 19th century, but we know so much more now that he didn't know. And that what we now know is that inside even the simplest cell, we have digital nanotechnology. We have the information stored in the DNA. We have an exquisite system of information storage, transmission, and processing. And that information is being used to build protein machines and other even more complex nanomachinery inside the cell. So it's a sort of automated factory run by digital information. People didn't know about that in the early 19th century.
You think the creator of the universe is God?
I do.
And then out of the universe comes the creation of a single cell, which again is God.
Right. Well, I just lost my mother, and I think the deepest and hardest questions in life are not actually these big metaphysical questions. I think if you think carefully about them, there's a pretty clear answer. But I think it's the questions that come up because of the events in your own life, and sometimes suffering, sometimes joys, why things went this way rather than that way. Those are the questions I think are the hardest ones, the existential questions of one's own personal experience.
I'm very sorry about your mother.
I think the experience of grief was something that was unexpected. And there's something about the grief experience that it seems to make everything else pale to insignificance in that moment. And I think it's kind of, my own view of it is this kind of a signal. Like your conscience tells you what's right and wrong. I think you're never really prepared for the loss of a parent, and I thought I was, but I wasn't.
Do you take comfort because of your religious conviction that you'll see your mother again in an afterlife?
I absolutely do, yeah. And I think that mysterious moment when you see a loved one passing, when the body is there, but the person is gone, it raises some profound metaphysical questions, or maybe a metaphysical awareness that there is something more than the material that is part of all of us. You're a believer. There's plenty of good, solid scientific evidence, good philosophical reasons for belief, but then there are these experiences too that we have along the way that suggest it's not just matter in motion.
And actually, a belief in God is, in a way, endorsed by those big questions, because the human brain cannot come up with any other logical explanation. So a logical explanation based on science and data, it doesn't exist. So here's the tough question. How could a fair, just God allow that to happen? When you look at what's happened in Israel and then Gaza in the last 6 months, a lot of people might question, well, why would a God that has the universal creative superpower of the kind that you believe God had to create all this, why would they allow such misery and hell? Have you thought about that?
Well, of course. There's a traditional theistic answer, goes back to St. Augustine and maybe earlier. The idea of sometimes called the free will defense if you're in an argument about the so-called problem of evil. I actually find it persuasive and compelling. And it's the idea that God created us as free moral agents and understood in creating us that way that he was taking a risk. That we could use our agency for good or for ill. We could use it to love him and to love the other creatures he's made. And we have instances of both on this planet. Redemption.
Do you believe in aliens?
Well, I'm very skeptical about extraterrestrial intelligence.
Isn't it more likely than not that there are aliens?
That's a very good question, Piers. It used to be thought among physicists and astrophysicists that the answer to that question was yes, because there's so many galaxies. And this is part of the cosmological question that's so fascinating. There must be life elsewhere.
But the truth is nobody knows. When atheists can't explain what happened before the Big Bang, and when they can't say that, and when they say nothing happens when you die and stuff, that's where my belief in God gets massively increased. Well, it's one of the main reasons I think there must be a God.